Fox News Podcasts presents the Bret Baier Podcast with Fox News chief political anchor Bret Baier.
Anti-government protests in Iran continue to escalate, spurred by nationwide unrest and high inflation. However, it looks like this could be about regime change eventually. President Trump has warned of military intervention if the death toll continues to rise, to which the Iranian government responded with threats of strikes on the U.S. and Israeli targets in the region. Back at home, the Department of Justice has launched a criminal investigation into Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, citing an abuse of taxpayer dollars pertaining to renovations at the Federal Reserve headquarters. However, Powell argues the investigation was sparked for a different reason, responding in a video released last Sunday.
The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation.
President Trump has denied any involvement in the investigation. Meanwhile, the Trump administration announced plans to deploy roughly hundreds more immigration officers to Minnesota, less than a week after a Minnesota woman was fatally shot during an altercation with an ICE agent. Lots to discuss this week. Let's bring in our panel. Director of Domestic Policy Studies and Neal Chair at the American Enterprise Institute, Matt Continetti. Democratic Campaign Strategist Kevin Walling, and Fox News Audio Washington-based correspondent Jared Halpern. Jared, first of all, the Iran situation. The president continues to support the Iranian protesters on Truth Social, saying essentially, hang in there, help is on the way. Previously saying that we, the U.S., were locked and loaded if protesters were dying. There are now accounts of thousands and thousands of protesters dying at the hands of the Iranian regime, and it seems we may be closer to action.
And it seems like the Iranian regime is also bringing some pretty dire warnings of their own to the table about the fate of some of these protests. I think the big question is, what is the president envisioning here with Iran? He has already imposed these 25% tariffs on trading partners with Iran. That is another form of economic pressure to put on the regime. He has talked about having an array of options on the table, including military intervention. But that, of course, would come with an awful lot of risk. One, to your point, it would make U.S. bases in the region at risk. It could potentially put Israel and their targets at risk. And it raises questions about regime change to what? What is the next step if, in fact, this protest is different than some of the previous uprisings we've seen in Iran and does topple this government, or at least elements of this government? What does that look like? And does that become a government that is an ally of the United States?
Yeah, Matthew, I think there is this sense that this is a different time, that this is maybe a hinge point.
Absolutely. You know, these revolts have been periodic for decades, Bret, but this is different for a few reasons. The first is the revolt in Iran began in the marketplace, not in the universities. Typically in the past, it was young students who were leading riots and protests against the mullahs who rule Iran. In this case, this revolution started in the marketplace, in the bazaar, with individuals who had just been shocked and made immiserated by the economic failures of the regime. So that's one difference. The second is the protests have now spread throughout the country, including rural areas that are normally thought of as strongholds of the Ayatollah Khamenei. And the third difference is President Trump. You know, in the past, most significantly in the Green Revolution of 2009, America just stood by while the regime suppressed the protesters. President Trump, coming off that victory in Operation Absolute Resolve, where we captured and arrested Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, he made it very clear that he was going to stand on the side of the protesters, and he drew a red line. He said if the Iranian government kills the protesters, America would act. Well, the numbers are high. We don't know the exact figure, but we know that the Iranians have killed protesters, and I think that's why President Trump is about to act.
Kevin, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely with Jared and Matthew in terms of their historical context. The fact that you're seeing these massive protests in the street, and of course, the regime has blocked out most internet access. So what we get is a kind of a grainy picture. But the fact that you're seeing activity across all 31 provinces, to Matthew's point, it has united elements of the civil society, the business element, as he mentioned, and then also the students as well, is different than we've seen in these previous periodic uprisings, similar to the one that we saw in 22 in the wake of the young woman who was killed by the morality police on the ground. So obviously the administration is weighing its options. There was a meeting today at the White House with senior national security advisors, and they've given every indication that all elements and all tactics are on the table, Brett.
Yeah, the other issue here is what it means and what Israel does, Jared. They're concerned about Iran and the regime and ballistic missiles and restaging its nuclear program. It seems like the regime has its hands full with these protests. And the question is, what it looks like if there was a military move and what the transition would be out of this regime that's been in power since 1979.
That's a great question, and it's got to be one of the considerations being made in that situation room with these national security advisors, because this would be an operation presumably different than Midnight Hammer, which was a specific target of these ballistic missile and nuclear weapons facilities. The idea was not to uproot the government, was not regime change. If the outcome of U.S. military action in the wake of these protests is regime change, then you have to have a plan for what comes next, especially in the context of the broader Middle East. One thing that, Arab partners are going to be concerned about, as much as they dislike the current Iranian government, is instability in the region. And does this create a security vacuum, a law enforcement vacuum, a terror vacuum that could kind of take root, given the instability that a regime change in Iran could present?
Panel, we'll hold it right there. Meantime, back here at home, you've got this criminal investigation into the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, citing his testimony about renovations on the Federal Reserve building up on Capitol Hill. Essentially, the pushback was pretty harsh from Powell, saying, one, he's always been honest, and two, this is more about pressuring him on interest rates than it is about anything criminal, Matthew. The other thing worth noting is that there was talk about this being about taxpayer dollars. The Federal Reserve doesn't take taxpayer dollars. It deals in an independent way outside of the congressional budget process.
Right. And if you're going to indict someone for cost overruns, then I think most of Washington would be sitting in jail right about now, with the way that this city spends money. But look, this story came out of the blue while most of us were watching NFL playoffs over the weekend with Chairman Powell's novel video, 2-minute video saying that he had been subpoenaed for these records. I thought it was really inventive on his part. He took the fight back to the Trump administration in a way that I don't think anyone was expecting. It put the administration on its back heels, Brett. And then on top of that, within 24 hours, you had Republicans in the House and in the Senate saying that this was a bad idea. Not only criticizing the idea of a criminal investigation of the chairman of the Federal Reserve, but in the case of Tom Tillis, who's retiring, the senator from North Carolina, a Republican, he said that he's not going to vote for any Trump nominees to the Fed until this matter is resolved. I think for whoever cooked up this idea, it was too clever by half. And what you see now is not only will there be a push to have a candidate for the next Federal Reserve chair. By the way, Jerome Powell's going to step down in May regardless from his chairmanship. So not only will you have a push to replace him with someone who shows some independence from Trump, but you might also have the possibility that Powell will remain on the Federal Reserve Board, not as chair, but just as a board member. Most chairmen don't do that, but Powell might think he has to do it now in order to continue the fight against Trump. So this is not a good situation for the administration.
It does seem like it's a bit of a backfire here, Jared.
And I think to Matthew's point, it makes it harder to confirm these nominees that President Trump is close to naming, not just because you have Tom Tillis saying that he'll hold these nominees up, but even if this, gets moved past and the Justice Department closes the investigation, it's going to continue to raise questions of these nominees about their independence. And one thing that Republicans and Democrats have seemed to agree on through all of this is the independence of the Federal Reserve, of the central bank. And so expect now these hearings to take on renewed interest, renewed importance, as senators want to make sure that whoever is nominated, not just to succeed Powell, but for these other openings that are happening on the Federal Reserve, that they'll also not be intimidated by President Trump or not be intimidated by members of the administration as they try and set these monetary policies.
Meantime, the other big story, obviously the follow-up, Kevin, to the Minnesota situation and the ICE agent and the shooting of the protester, the woman in the car. In response to that and all the activity that's happening in protests on the ground, there are plans to deploy hundreds more, maybe 1,100 more agents, ICE agents, to the ground in Minnesota. And there are now pleas from Minnesota lawmakers, including the mayor, including Senator Klobuchar and others, to reanalyze that before things get out of hand.
Yeah, Brett, I mean, this has been a fairly incredible story in terms of its ability to break through the news cycle. I saw polling that something like upwards of 80% of the American electorate have seen the video of Renee Good in the situation with ICE earlier this month. So obviously optics matter in politics and shaping our impressions on these issues. And, obviously we've also seen kind of both sides retreat to their silos, whether it be, the Secretary of Homeland Security calling Ms. Good and those individuals on the ground domestic terrorists, and then obviously the kind of backlash that we've seen from the left in terms of folks taking to the streets, trying to obstruct more of this behavior and investigation work by ICE on the ground. So it's obviously a polarizing event with the noted element of that visceral video driving so much of the dialogue around these particular deployments of ICE.
And the question, Matthew, is, what this policy looks like going forward. Obviously, it's not just Minnesota. It's all over the place that this pushback is happening. Right.
Mass deportations happening across the country, as Trump promised during the election. And you get these combustible and extremely unfortunate situation in the case of the shooting of Renee Good, in places that follow sanctuary city policies, Brett, where the local police and law enforcement aren't participating. They aren't doing crowd control. They aren't clearing the roads before these ICE operations. It leads to a situation where these protesters can come in and try to obstruct ICE operations, and it can get bad very quickly, as we've seen. So I think a few things. One is I see the administration escalating their rhetoric and their policies, whereas Democrats in the days since the shooting have kind of backtracked. They're lessening their calls for people in the streets, for getting in people's faces. You have debate on the Hill about whether there should be another government shutdown unless there's Homeland Security and ICE reform. And Democratic leadership does not seem to be very comfortable with that notion. And you also have this question, are the Democrats really going to want to go into the 2026 election with abolish ICE as their flag, as their standard? So it's an awful thing that happened last week. But what I think politically, we have Trump continuing to see what he believes is a winning issue, mass deportations.
Jared, I like to ask this question occasionally, and that is, with all of the news swirling, and there's a lot of it, it's like drinking from a fire hose, what are we not focused on?
Well, I think if you talk to the administration, they'd like a little bit more focus on the economy. Now, that's a sticky wicket, too, I think, because there are a lot of polls that show that the American public is not as satisfied with the economy as President Trump and those would like. But you look at the events on President Trump's schedule, right? Speaking at the Detroit Economic Club, talking about manufacturing in places like Pennsylvania, in places like North Carolina. Those are important issues for this White House because they are trying to roll out this affordability agenda. Connected to that, and I think it's connected to the ICE enforcement as well, is this story seems to get woven with this issue of fraud and abuse. And obviously, we've seen these allegations out of Minnesota. But just this week, last week, that the vice president announced this new attorney general position that's going to be dedicated solely to rooting out this fraud, and not just in Minnesota. He said he talked specifically about California and Ohio, and says that this is happening, they believe, in all 50 states. So I think that's also a message that you're going to see President Trump and Republicans try to carry into the midterms on an issue that they view as much more winnable than some of these other issues that Democrats are going to be focusing on.
Yeah, and it'll be fascinating to see, with all of the big things happening overseas, if it overtakes the news cycle or the domestic issues start breaking through significantly ahead of the midterms. Gentlemen, thanks. Now for a bit of history. On January 15th, 1919, a 58-foot-high tank containing 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst, flooding the streets of Boston with burning hot caramelized sugar. The flood began in the heart of Boston at the United States Industrial Alcohol Building, sending an 8-foot-high wave of molasses, which toppled the local firehouse and tore through support beams for an elevated train line. The incident resulted in the deaths of 21 people, dozens of horses, and required a weeks-long cleanup effort. After a 6-year investigation spurred on by hundreds of lawsuits, the company was found responsible for the incident and ordered to pay more than $1 million in damages. How about that? That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download your favorite podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating and a review. We want to hear from you. For Matt, Kevin, and Jared, I'm Bret Baier. We'll see you next time. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.